Bom dia, senhoras e senhores. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Buenos dias, senhoras e senhores. Saudamos a todos que estão presentes para a cerimônia de abertura do segundo Simpósio Internacional Pan-Americano de Toponímia, especialmente os convidados de honra dessa importante sessão de abertura. Topônimos ou nomes geográficos são mais do que nomes de lugares em mapa. São uma forma importante de comunicação, ligando organizações locais, nacionais e internacionais em todos os níveis de cooperação. São também informações geográficas que afetam todas as áreas da sociedade, alcançando e integrando elementos de história, geografia, cartografia, linguagem, linguística, cultura, tradição, folclore, psicologia, política, indicações geográficas, serviços cadastrais e de registro de pessoas, entre outros. A toponímia pode conectar o homem e a terra, carregando um forte significado cultural. O objetivo geral do Sipat 2021 é reunir pesquisadores, técnicos e usuários das mais diversas áreas do conhecimento do Brasil, das Américas e globalmente também, para ter uma visão interdisciplinar sobre toponímia ou nomes geográficos, visando a troca de experiências, pesquisas e questionamentos em todas as suas áreas de aplicação. Constitui-se, assim, uma oportunidade ímpar de troca de informações, experiências e questões entre pesquisadores, contribuindo para a disseminação desse campo tão relevante no contexto geográfico e nos demais a este relacionados. Tenho a imensa satisfação, neste momento, de apresentar os convidados de honra da cerimônia de abertura do segundo Sipat, cientistas renomados na área de toponímia no Brasil e no mundo. Em nome dos comitês científicos e organizador do segundo Sipat, a minha palavra de gratidão a todos por terem aceito o nosso convite. Eu gostaria, então, de compor a mesa da cerimônia de abertura pelo senhor Cláudio Stener, diretor de Geociências do Instituto Brasileiro de Geografia e Estatística. O engenheiro Hélio Gouveia Prado, presidente da Sociedade Brasileira de Cartografia, SBC. Doutora Ellen Kerfoot, Honorary Chair da United Nations Group of Experts on Geographical Names, UNGAGN. Professor Dr. Jerry O'Reilly, da Dublin City University, Irlanda, e vice-presidente da EuroGeo, European Association of Geographers. Dr. Peter Jordan, da Academia Austríaca de Ciências, OEW, Chair por parte da ICA, na Comissão Conjunta ICA-UGI em Toponímia. Vou proferir agora algumas palavras de bem-vindos para todos os participantes desse simpósio. Prezados convidados, colegas e participantes do segundo Simpósio Internacional Pan-Americano de Toponímia. Após algum tempo, a segunda edição do Sipat, Simpósio Internacional Pan-Americano de Toponímia, é finalmente uma realidade. A primeira edição foi realizada em maio de 2017, presencialmente, nas dependências da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, com as parcerias do IBGE, da UGI e da ICA. Foi um evento pequeno, com 78 participantes e apresentação de 24 trabalhos e 6 palestras especiais. Esta versão deveria ter sido realizada em 2019, mas por motivos de força maior teve que ser postergada para 2020, sendo então surpreendida pela pandemia do Covid-19. Assim, com o apoio do Instituto Brasileiro de Geografia e Estatística, IBGE, do Conselho Nacional de Desenvolvimento Científico e Tecnológico, CNPq, da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, por meio do seu programa de pós-graduação em Geografia, PPGG, UFRJ, e do GeoCart, Laboratório de Cartografia do Departamento de Geografia da UFRJ, e endossado pela United Nations Group of Experts on Geographical Names, UNGACN, pelo Instituto Pan-Americano de Geografia e História, IPGH, e pela União Geográfica Internacional, UGI, pela Associação Cartográfica Internacional, ICA, por meio de sua comissão conjunta, UGI-ACI, em Toponímia. Estamos realizando o segundo Sipat. Fruto de uma grande dedicação e da vontade de apresentar um evento com as características integrativas e multidisciplinares que já configuram a marca do Sipat. Atualmente, os nomes geográficos assumem um alto nível de importância em praticamente todas as áreas de conhecimento. Essa é uma das formas mais utilizadas para acessar o espaço geográfico em relação aos mundos real, analógico ou digital. Além disso, fornece uma estrutura de geolocalização indispensável para qualquer sistema de informações espacialmente organizado e permite a integração e interoperabilidade entre os conjuntos de dados digitais, constituindo-se uma ferramenta poderosa de tomada de decisão em todos os níveis para políticos e gestores, sejam eles privados ou governamentais. Podemos dizer o quanto pode parecer estranho o desconhecimento do alcance do impacto dos nomes geográficos na sociedade como um todo, em todos os níveis de administração pública ou privada, bem como local, regional e internacionalmente. Como verificar os transtornos da mudança do nome de uma cidade? Particularmente, eu sou natural da cidade do Rio de Janeiro, mas também fui do Distrito Federal, do Estado da Guanabara e agora do Estado do Rio de Janeiro. As públicas. O ato de nominar é inerente à atividade humana. São nominados os próprios seres humanos, como também os lugares, permitindo a sua individualização e a consequente identificação de um e de outro. O que acompanha esse ato de nominação, quais sejam cargas culturais, atávicas, linguísticas, políticas e tantas outras, são as motivações para o desenvolvimento da pesquisa toponímica. Todo esse universo toponímico será discutido nesses 3 dias. Incentivamos a todos que participem e acompanhem os trabalhos e palestras que estão programados. Questionem, perguntem e discutam os conceitos e os temas apresentados. Aproveitem a presença dos pesquisadores renomados que estão conosco e expandam as suas redes de contato. Temos certeza que, no fim desse evento, estaremos já com vontade de desenvolver o próximo. Vamos ver um pouco dos números atuais do Sipat. Tivemos 270 inscritos, 14 palestrantes especiais convidados, 33 comunicações científicas entre trabalhos completos e resumos expandidos. Participantes de todos os estados brasileiros e do Distrito Federal. Participantes dos seguintes países: África do Sul, Argentina, Brasil, evidente, Canadá, Espanha, Estados Unidos da América, Holanda, Indonésia, Irlanda, Itália, México, Moçambique, Peru, Portugal e Venezuela. Além das áreas de conhecimento, até o presente data, pelo menos 21 áreas foram informadas pelos inscritos no evento: geografia, história, linguística, arquitetura e urbanismo, educação, ciência da computação, oceanografia, arqueologia, engenharia ambiental, botânica, medicina, ciências contábeis, letras, biblioteconomia, biologia geral, ciência da informação, engenharia cartográfica e agrimensura, engenharia de transportes, serviço social, ecologia e planejamento urbano. E isso mostra claramente a característica multidisciplinar que envolve a pesquisa da toponímia. Finalmente, alguns agradecimentos têm que ser feitos obrigatoriamente neste momento, além de todos aqueles que nós já realizamos no início da nossa fala. Aos nossos professores e alunos voluntários que não aparecem, mas são essenciais em nossa retaguarda para o bom andamento de cada uma das atividades do simpósio. Mas tem que fazer um agradecimento muito especial à doutora Raquel Desidério Souto, a nossa secretária-geral do Sipat. por todo o seu trabalho, a sua dedicação, sem o qual, certamente, esse evento não teria o brilho que apresenta. Agradecemos, finalmente, à empresa de eventos, a Event3, pelo profissionalismo do seu trabalho no desenvolvimento da plataforma do evento, bem como também à empresa Orientes Produções, pelo suporte nos idiomas com a tradução simultânea português-inglês e inglês-português das sessões especiais do evento. Agradeço mais uma vez a presença do público nos acompanhando, mesmo que seja virtualmente. Estaremos juntos nesse encontro. Aproveitem todos o evento. Muito obrigado. Gostaria de passar a palavra, nesse momento, para o Dr. Cláudio Stenner, diretor de Geociências do Instituto Brasileiro de Geografia e Estatística, IBGE.
Muito obrigado, Paulo. É com muita honra e satisfação que o IBGE participa e apoia este evento. Acho que os nomes geográficos são absolutamente centrais na sociedade contemporânea, e se a gente for fazer um paralelo, né, uma sociedade que alguns anos atrás era uma sociedade que tinha uma menor mobilidade no território. Então, a gente pode fazer um paralelo que o peso do nome geográfico tinha um sentido predominante de pertencimento, né, de identidade daquele território, do local de nascimento, dos locais da vizinhança onde aquela população frequentava. À medida que a sociedade vai se tornando mais conectada e ela se desloca mais pelo território, o nome geográfico ele vai ganhando um peso maior do ponto de vista econômico, do ponto de vista de apropriação de novos territórios. Quer dizer, a economia, como a gente conhece hoje, serviços como Uber, iFood, Mercado Livre, ela depende, em grande medida, da existência de nomes geográficos organizados. E isso do ponto de vista de um país e do ponto de vista internacional também. Nome geográfico, evidentemente, está associado a poder, né? E não é à toa que os países disputam a denominação, por exemplo, de mares, Mar da China ou Mar do Japão, né? Ou de ilhas, Ilhas Malvinas ou Falklands. Ou quando um determinado povo ele conquista um outro território, os nomes mudam. Por exemplo, Tenochtitlan virou a cidade do México. Então, essa relação do nome geográfico com o poder, né, com a apropriação, ela é muito forte, muito importante, e é cada vez mais relevante na sociedade que a gente vive, justamente por essa circulação maior de pessoas globalmente dentro dos países. Né? E, bom, fazendo um link com a missão do IBGE, propriamente dita, eu acho que isso é essencial para o IBGE, melhorar cada vez mais a identificação dos nomes geográficos no território brasileiro e prover, vamos dizer assim, essa infraestrutura de informação para a sociedade, né, para um melhor desenvolvimento cultural, melhor desenvolvimento econômico da sociedade brasileira. Então, dentro dessa missão do IBGE, a gente tem, eu acho que a intenção e a demanda de melhorar o acesso do usuário aos nomes geográficos através de interfaces, né, que facilitem esse processo, e melhorar também a identificação desses nomes geográficos. A gente vai ter uma oportunidade no próximo ano, que é o censo demográfico, né, onde milhões e milhões de nomes de localidades serão ditos pelas pessoas moradoras, e será uma oportunidade para que a gente possa incrementar o conjunto de nomes geográficos disponíveis para a sociedade brasileira a partir dessa informação. No mais, eu gostaria de desejar um ótimo evento a todos e sucesso total para esse simpósio de tanta importância para o país e para as Américas. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, Cláudio, por suas palavras. Passo a palavra agora para o engenheiro Hélio Gouveia Prado, presidente da Sociedade Brasileira de Cartografia.
Abrindo meu microfone facilita. Bom dia a todos. Eu gostaria, inicialmente, de cumprimentar os organizadores deste segundo Sipat. Foi, assim como a sociedade organiza vários eventos, o professor Paulo já foi nosso vice-presidente também, a gente sabe o quanto tem de problemático, o quanto tem de trabalho de emprego individual dos organizadores. E a Sociedade Brasileira de Cartografia sente-se honrada, tá, com o convite para a participação desse evento. Como sociedade, e eu particularmente, exatamente por ser um engenheiro cartógrafo e trabalhar na área de cartografia há mais de 20 anos, conheço bem a questão dos nomes geográficos. Primeiramente, eu gostaria de fazer uma breve apresentação oral mesmo da sociedade, que a Sociedade Brasileira de Cartografia é, como diz o nosso estatuto, uma associação civil de caráter técnico-científico, certo? Com a finalidade de enaltecer e estimular o progresso das ciências cartográficas, geodésicas, fotogramétricas e de sensoriamento remoto. Certo? Dito isso, eu gostaria também de citar uma definição que eu gosto muito de cartografia, que é uma definição antiga da Unesco de 1966, e eu vou me permitir ler aqui, que a cartografia apresenta-se como conjunto de estudos e operações científicas, técnicas e artísticas, que, tendo por base os resultados de observações diretas ou da análise de documentação, se voltam para a elaboração de mapas, cartas e outras formas de expressão e representação de objetos, elementos, fenômenos e ambientes físicos e socioeconômicos, bem como sua utilização. E nessa utilização, eu cito a importância da toponímia. Como disse o professor Paulo, são os nomes dos elementos cartográficos, ou nomes geográficos, ou topônimos. Certo? E a toponímia, eu entendo que ela basicamente tenderia para individualizar esses elementos. Quando a gente coloca nome em algumas coisas, naquele nosso universo de trabalho, nós estamos pensando em individualizar aquele elemento no seu universo. Mas a gente sabe que essa individualização não ocorre. Daí a necessidade de um tratamento científico dessa situação. E eu digo um tratamento científico, como eu comentei, eu trabalho com a área de produção cartográfica e de geração de informações há muito tempo. E vou citar, por exemplo, um exemplo de limites. Limites territoriais, podem ser ele entre instituições ou entre entes privados. Um limite ele é definido por um instrumento jurídico. Esse instrumento jurídico pode ser um tratado, pode ser uma lei, um decreto ou uma escritura e até mesmo uma sentença. Quando os anteriores falham, é recorrido à área jurídica. E esses limites estabelecidos nesses documentos jurídicos, eles podem ser limites naturais ou limites geométricos ou artificiais. Os naturais tendem sempre a repousar-se sobre a toponímia. Você faz um limite por um rio e cita o nome desse rio até um determinado acidente. Normalmente, a partir desse acidente, você continua por um outro limite natural, ou a partir dali você começa um limite artificial. E a questão de toponímia, ela se reveste de um grande, vamos dizer, interesse, porque quando você define, por exemplo, o nome de um rio, esse rio vai servir de limite entre dois estados independentes. Esse rio pode ter um nome para um estado e o mesmo rio no outro estado ter outro nome. No caso das nossas fronteiras brasileiras, temos alguns casos desse tipo. E outra questão também que se tem é a questão da duplicidade, não só do mesmo nome ou de dois nomes para o mesmo elemento, ou do mesmo nome para vários elementos. O IBGE tem uma divisão, não vou sei se é uma divisão, tem uma estrutura, na sua estrutura, uma área de estruturas territoriais que se debruça sobre a questão dos limites intermunicipais e interestaduais. Então, normalmente, e com alguma frequência, vamos dizer assim, eles se debruçam sobre esse problema. Então, nós temos também não só essa questão da duplicidade, teremos também a questão da imprecisão, pois nós podemos chegar a um nome geográfico achando que aquele nome é preciso, e na própria região, esse mesmo acidente geográfico ter vários nomes dentro de um mesmo estado, dentro de um mesmo povo, dentro de um mesmo país. E, por último, como já foi citado aqui, a sua alteração no tempo. Um nome geográfico pode variar com o tempo. Isso também na questão de limites, eu estou focando aqui na questão de limites, porque é uma questão que sempre traz alguma preocupação para estados independentes. Essas alterações de um nome geográfico, quando ele é citado numa situação de delimitação entre dois estados, é uma questão que pode gerar um tipo de, vamos dizer, de trauma ou de tensão entre os dois povos. Então, eu pretendi, né, com essa assim, visão rápida, demonstrar e mostrar a importância do estudo sério e científico da toponímia, dos nomes geográficos e de tudo aquilo que os envolve. Gostaria também de deixar votos de excelente evento para todos e que possamos ter grande fruto no nosso trabalho. Bom dia a todos.
Muito obrigado, Gouveia, pelas suas palavras. E eu gostaria de passar a palavra agora para a doutora Ellen Kerfoot, Honorary Chair do United Nations Group of Experts on Geographical Names. Helen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Paolo. I hope everybody can hear me. First, thank you, Paolo, and members of the conference organizing committee, the local support team, and all who've been involved with organizing this conference amidst the difficulties of COVID. I know arranging a virtual conference is time-consuming and poses many questions not experienced in a person-to-person gathering. So a big thank you from all of us. Next, as Honorary Chair of the United Nations Group of Experts on Geographical Names, or UNGEGN, I would like to welcome all those making presentations or linking into the conference. UNGEGN was created by a decision of the UN Economic and Social Council and met for the first time in 1960. Since then, through conferences and sessions, efforts have been made for every country to have a national authority responsible for the written forms of its geographical names. Over the 60 years, progress has been made by providing guidelines and advice through publications and training courses, by establishing scientific romanization systems, and by giving leadership in database development. At the outset of our work, technical aspects related to georeference systems and the demands of mapping were paramount, but gradually the cultural aspect of toponyms in relation to language, history, and identity has gained significance. However, today, much work still remains for each country to have authorized geographical names that are widely available. And it's occasions like this conference that provide incentive, scientific advice, and most valuable reference material for those in toponymic administration. It's here that presentations and discussions take place on the toponymic issues of the day. And Angegen is currently considering the relationship of geographical names to the environment and to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and also the impact of principles of equality on naming practices. And as a Canadian, I'm very aware of the increased interest in toponymy of Indigenous peoples, particularly in regard to their languages, cultures, and rights. A number of papers being presented this week will be of direct interest and benefit to those striving in their own countries to establish principles and procedures of geographical naming that appropriately address the societal issues of today. So I think all of you, and I thank all of you who have spent time with your research and developing your papers. And I certainly wish everybody a great experience and a very successful and profitable conference. So thank you. Obrigada, gracias. Thank you,
Thank you
Paulo.
so much. Thank you so much, Helen, for your words. E agora eu gostaria de convidar o professor Dr. Cosimo Palladiano, da Sapienza Universidade de Roma, que é o chair por parte da União Geográfica Internacional, da Comissão Conjunta ICA-UGI em Toponímia. Cosimo, you have the floor.
Thank you, Paulo. I'm very happy to be able to attend this conference. Unfortunately, the unfortunate pandemic does not allow to meet and once again enjoy your company in the beautiful city of Rio. I sincerely hope that soon we will be able to meet each other and discuss the projects we would like to carry out in our commission, ICA-IGU Commission on Toponymy. In the meantime, I offer my warmest wishes for the success of this Congress, but I have no doubt, given the perfect organization taken care of in all its aspects. So I thank Paul and his team for inviting me. I greet with pleasure my mutual friend Peter, whom I met personally in Naples a few weeks ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cosimo, for your words. And now, e agora eu gostaria de convidar o professor Dr. Jerry O'Reilly, da Dublin City University, da Irlanda, vice-presidente do Eurogeo, European Association of Geographers. E o professor Jerry, ele irá fazer uma apresentação de trabalho sobre toponímia dentro dessa nossa sessão de abertura. Jerry, please, you have the floor. Your micro is not on.
Sorry about that. Good morning, everybody. I'll just open up the presentation here. And right, I feel more reassured now that it has popped up. Well, thank you once again to Paulo and the organizing team. And thank you for inviting me. Today, I'm going to look at place naming and identities and geography, critical perspectives in a globalizing and standardizing world. You could say that's a huge agenda, especially with such an expert group of people around me. And I would not say I'm an expert yet in the area. So I will take an approach of looking at what is going on as I perceived out there in the whole world of naming and toponymy, and I'll explain that later on. I am Vice President of Eurogeo, and in the Department of Geography, School of History and Geography in Dublin City University. So then, looking at toponymy and hydronymy in 2021, there is a renewed critical interest, I would argue. So, with location and cartographical aspects, etymology, geohistories were very salient in past studies, and they're now being enhanced from a range of radical perspectives, especially in a globalizing, standardizing world with Googleization and the consequent normalization of place names, perceptions, and images worldwide, including those for marketing purposes. However, there remain conflicting and contesting voices, and rightly so. So, the idea of a project on geographical naming on land and sea was proposed to me by EuroGeo, the European Association of Geographers, and also Springer International publications that work with EuroGeo. And the idea was to look at the theories, concepts, and case studies and educational approaches in relation to toponymy. Therefore, I said, how will I do this? Where does one start? So the work is very interdisciplinary, with authors from all regions, national and international toponymy-related institutions and organizations, including the GIGN and International Geographical Union, the International Cartographic Association, and so forth. So some of the keywords I'll be using today are naming, place, critical perspectives, standardizing, contesting voices, and education, which is a very important one in the research. Now, this research on toponymy really is the third in a series of books that I have been working on. The idea behind the books in EuroGeo, in collaboration with Springer, is to take important aspects of geography that are very, very much related to the everyday and sometimes not quite obvious for students and trainers of students. Therefore, my task was to prepare material appropriate for third level students, but more so for the trainers of trainers and teachers. So by taking in the first area, my specialist area is geopolitics, but looking at that in perspective to humanitarian action and geography in times of conflict, whereby students and people are constantly exposed to it every day in the news and with social media. Then also then, when that was completed, looking at spaces of memory and legacies in an age of insecurities and globalization. So that brought me into research the geopolitics and geographies of emotions. And we saw this particularly in the last 10 years. So looking at the geographies of emotions, what really shapes people's attitudes, and in particular, the general public and everyday events. So in that context, my third attempt here is with toponymy. So, as aforementioned, this toponymy book explores multiple contemporary and applied aspects of geopolitics, as well as the geopolitics of emotions in transition. The trajectory then from the conceptual to the actual production of this toponymy book project. The presentation then of information regarding this trajectory will be looked at today with reference to chapters, writers, and their research before opening the floor for questions and answers. And the approach I took was I invited people directly, and the response was overwhelming. And I left the content quite open to the interpretation of the invitees, so that I could get a larger picture of perceptions and what is actually going on in many countries and internationally in relation to toponymy. I had 55 responses. Sorry, I had 65 responses, and 50 of them are suitable for the specific book project. So I was amazed by the response and the interest of people to it. And it wasn't just within my own colleagues at work or in relation to Eurogeo, but from a very, very broad spectrum of people. So, reading between the lines then, from the different responses from the people who answered my call, what are the key ideas that are coming through? Geopolitics, territorialization, lessons of history and geohistory, recurring nationalism, the UN involvement, and a sub-theme of a multilateral approach versus a unilateral approach towards in that whole nexus of culture, history, geography, as made reference to by the previous speakers. But very often the state paradigm comes in, and its approach to the boundaries, not alone territorial, but more and more so, as we're witnessing, particularly in Southeast Asia, in relation to the seas. And of course, its relevance for the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But in all that, when you look at the different types of naming, top down, bottom up, and how toponymy is used, much of it relates back to the geopolitics of emotions and recent histories. As was mentioned by Helen, of course this has a strong significance with the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of them I've been particularly exploring is SDG number 16, Peace, Justice, and Strong Institutions with the Rule of Law. But of course, the research in toponymy, the great research which many people here today have been carrying out, relates very, very much so to a positive geopolitics of peace building. And I strongly believe the work that you are carrying out contributes to such. So thank you to all those people involved in this book project, and there are several of them following today. So I didn't know exactly how to present this slide, but it's to say a big thank you. So 30 chapters are in progress with over 50 writers, perspectives from all continents, with a very large diversity of authors and standpoints. Also, as Paulo indicated earlier on, it is very multidisciplinary, but also, being a native English speaker, I'm very aware of the importance of other languages, because sometimes English-speaking people who have such an impact at a global level in international organizations and, how would you say, production of material on toponymy, sometimes the English-speaking people need to be reminded of the importance of other languages within that. Also, a lot of the material that people are using on this book project, it's from original sources and archives, as with the colleagues in Ljubljana, in Sarajevo, and in Brazil, and other examples. And I'm most pleased that Eurogeo and Springer have backed the production of this book project, and that it will have an effect on third level higher end students, but more so on the training of trainers who will be dealing with education and projects in many of these countries. Hence, the book research aims, well, to deconstruct the nexus between theory, concepts, place, space, endonym, exonym, toponymy, which you're all very, very familiar with, but to explore the significance of toponymy in everyday life for ordinary people, and the managerial political sphere, of course, to elucidate the role of the stakeholders in place naming, top down and bottom up. Therefore, identity, grassroots, culture, populace, public, and NGOs, how they use it, as with local development groups. Therefore, the government organizations and international government organizations, UNESCO, and again, Council of Europe, EU, and other institutions, but also within that more and more I found, as I was discussing the ideas with the chapter writers, the whole colonial, neo-colonial heritages, and not just within the global South, because very many people, I believe, think of whom speak of colonial heritage, they're only speaking of the global South, whereas in fact, it is very, very relevant in different ways to the global North. That is, looking at these naming situations within and between states. And then the final aim, to communicate with wider audiences beyond the academic, disciplinary, language, methodological, and the proverbial echo chambers. So I feel with the great response I had that people from many different organizations or associations are communicating very much so in this project. Now, moving on to the next slide. Toponymy and the geopolitics of emotions is a phrase, an idea which I've developed, which I have borrowed from Dominique Moisy, and I like his works very, very much, of that sometimes in our very logical frameworks as academics and researchers, sometimes we underestimate the force of emotions and particularly now in a world with social media just beyond the national boundaries, whereby place naming and associated ideas can have a profound emotional effect on people, but also their reactions. Therefore, with place naming, perception, how it's used, interpreted and reinterpreted, forgotten, hidden, or cut out of the map and the narrative, literally. The power of the control of place and naming. So we go there into very much the Foucauldian concepts of power, powerful, but instead of just seeing that as negative, they hold a powerful potential for consensus building and education if used for ethical purposes, as opposed to negative ends, whether they be territorial and power paradigms, which can nourish populism. Place, name, and memory. There are psychosocial associations, whether that be joy, nostalgia, but also of conscience and shame. And this is, again, recognized by UNESCO and other international institutions and organizations. The psychogeographies and histories then are important. I put the call out for collaborators and writers, and it was very, very short on purpose in order to see the different interests of the responses. And from some keyword analysis then, excuse me, I then tried to break the different proposals into blocks. And for example, what determined part one of the book? From keyword analysis, the word perception, reoccurrence of that word, then neo-toponymy. Other proposals that very much emphasized the divide between endonym and exonyms, the challenges then that were brought out, but also other words like commemorative and very much so the word scale. And examples of those came through in the chapter proposals from Korea, France, Argentina, Slovenia, and Spain. The authors emphasize the physicality of the places, but also the symbolism and the active usage by the stakeholders, but also how that can be manipulated for positive or negative reasons. Therefore, the research and resultant book had its objectives and its outcomes, as I mentioned, the nexus and concepts, continuity and change for each generation, material and existential, reasons for conflict regarding toponymy, and the importance of consensus. Analyzed by 50 authors and the project, diverse standpoints, research sources in original language, for example, Greek, Turkish, Bosnian, Portuguese, Spanish, German, which very much enhances the approach and the range of ideas supported by the project from Eurogeo and Springer. Now, in part one, as the chapters found their niche, you have the challenging conceptual theoretical approaches to place naming. For example, the validity of critical toponymy perspectives for an understanding of human perception on place from Sunjae Chao, from Korea, who also works with you in the special committees at the UN. The Place Naming and Neo-Toponymy, a French experience through the lens of a theoretical framework by Frédéric Giraud, our colleague in Geneva. The endonym-exonym divide, Peter Jordan and Kohei Wantabi. Geographical names in Argentina. Commemorative place naming. To Claim the Past to Repair Futures by Derek Alderman in Texas. And a very, very interesting approach there from Derek in looking at street naming and such place naming in Paris, where the feminist movement a few years ago looked at street names and then wrote down women's names rather than men after doing the statistical analysis at the complete underrepresentation of female names in places in street naming and place naming in Paris, but also then looking at the BLM in Black Lives Matter movement and the whole debate on place naming in the USA, particularly in the last 2 years. Toponymy and the change of scale, very much so, analyzes the concept of scale, and its importance, but the areas that are fluid between the different scales as used in Spain. The difference between a very legalistic national authority and the struggle to avoid conflict, but also democratically work with regional and local authorities in the place naming. The second natural coming together of ideas and bouncing one another came from my friend Vladimir Kolosov and the Russian School of Place Naming. And most interesting to see the work of the Academy of Science and Place Naming in Russia and the great period of transitions there in the last 30 years. Then from the colleagues in Slovenia, a standardization of geographical names on land and sea. And again, in its state building in Slovenia and standardization, Trojan work is going on. And I very, very much learned a lot from Drago and Macka there. Another paper that came in that I was fascinated by was the place of the New Zealand Geographic Board in advancing the cultural politics of place naming. And of course, the approach towards bilingualism in some places and the very positive steps being taken in recognition of the Maori culture and people. Conflict and challenges in standardization of geographical names in Spain looks very much, Ayar looks at the top-down approach. He works at the ministry responsible for toponymy and all the legal side, which I found fascinating because of the differences in national approaches, but also their legal systems in implementing legislation in relation to place naming. Another interesting one that stood out was major development projects and place naming issues in Saudi Arabia. Ali Al-Dorsi looked at the idea of places being developed now into large tourism or project sites, and the whole issue of place names being imposed on them from the top for commercial and some political, mostly commercial importance, but a certain backlash or reluctance on the part of local people. Also, urban toponymy is looked at. So just a summary then of the main words coming out in part 2. As I mentioned, Russian school of place name, very, very legalistic and clear in what is legal and non-legal, but the realities on the ground need to be further explored. Standardization of naming in Slovenia, and of course with its neighbors, including Austria. The New Zealand Geographic Board advancing the cultural politics of place naming. Standardization in Spain, Saudi Arabia, and toponymy in Turkey, which has a very interesting history in toponymy, but particularly at the moment under the Erdogan regime. The third block that came out in the natural evolution was cultural crossroads and toponymy, place naming, and a case study of Bosnia-Herzegovina with colleagues from the area, and also an input from Marko Krebs from Ljubljana, who works with them. And a very interesting approach with recreating the future modern housing estates and existing toponyms in Sarajevo. Now, Elsa and her colleague are from the Faculty of Architecture in Sarajevo, and it's most interesting to see many of the dilemmas that the architects face in relation to place naming. The geohistory of the Mohacs Plain is explored, and of course, Hungary being a crossroads for languages and cultures, and at the same time having a very, very strong toponymic cultural historical base. Theorizing multiple or plural place names in Southern Africa is explored by Tendai Magena, and most interesting again to see various local approaches historically, and of course, the whole story of the colonial imposition of naming. Then there is also the whole narrative of Catalonia and how the bilingualism is now legal there, but also part of school curricula and so forth, and how this is impacting on changing names within Catalonia. Street naming in Malta provides a very rich text, not alone for Malta as a unique place, but also emblematic of many parts of the Mediterranean and the world. And then perspectives from Brazil on the Lusitania maps and their use in toponymy, presented by Paulo and Menez and his colleagues. So in summary then, cultural crossroads in Bosnia-Herzegovina, modern housing estates, geohistory of naming in sensitive areas such as the Mohacs Plain in Hungary, and particularly the regime in power in Hungary at the moment. It has a very, very, how would I say, strict policy in relation to naming or name changing. Multiple plural place names in Southern Africa, language policies in Catalonia, street naming, and then perspectives from Brazil. So you can see the richness in part 2. Now, the naming of Estonian farms, I hadn't thought of it in many ways, but again, a rich area giving insights into naming places. And that is analyzed with the transition from the Soviet to the post-Soviet era and the collective farms being broken up, and then the search for names and which names are being used, pre-collectivization or variations of the collectivization names in that period. In the case study on Indonesia, it concerns the Bandung Basin in West Java, and it is taken from a strong anthropological and linguistic approach. Variations on those two I've just spoken about come into the rich historical to new place naming in the case of Italy, presented by Laura Cassi. Regarding Ireland and the toponymic landscapes, Jonathan Cherry, Brian O'Rahla, and Una Brachnach are looking at this toponymic landscape, and it's very, very rich in their approach. One, it is a mixture, that team, a mixture of academics, but also people who work for the National Naming Commission here in Dublin. And again, with Ireland's rich history of layering of cultures and languages, this can produce all sorts of collaborations and interesting insights into the political culture of the island. This is followed by translating topographies, the salience of Brian Friel's linguistic approach to landscape, and toponymy regarding Ireland by Professor Charlie Travis from Texas University. The continuing with part of that theme, colonialism and the global north and linguistics and naming and so forth, Jennifer Ballantyne Pereira is looking at Gibraltar from a Gibraltarian perspective. And again, the whole intermix of political cultures. Most important then, in regarding that, we have the UN capacity building in toponymy with Ferjan Helen and Pierre Giorgio, and I met two of you today for the first time, thanks to this conference, and that I found very, very interesting, and to see the very positive work being done by this group in relation to education. While it's very, very practical in the training of trainers, it also takes into account the larger vision. So it's that juxtaposition of the very practical in relation to agreement, peace building, consensus, and naming, the academic, but the greater sensitivity. Then from Israel, Talia Weissel is looking at the mystery of hydronymy on land and sea, particularly on land and sea in Israel. A similar approach is being taken by Leah Galani, who worked with me on the memory book, in relation to toponymy in Greece, but also the impact of Greek toponymy historically throughout the Mediterranean. And the final contribution will be from Prof. Ruth McManus here in Dublin, my colleague, bringing together place naming with self-directed work for groups and reflection for groups and for students and trainers in the area. Therefore, that's just a summary of what I have said there. Naming farms, the importance of anthropology, evaluating historical juxtaposed with new names, reading landscapes, translating such through the arts and emotions, decolonizing toponymy, the UN, and again, and it's very important work, hydronymy in Israel, geohistories in Greece and the Mediterranean, and then their use in education, the interplay. Overall conclusions, the nexus between those ideas I have been speaking of, the nexus is complex and messy. Place, psychology, memory, landscape, geopolitics, past, present, and future. Of course, by its very nature, it's complex and messy, and hopefully the different perspectives will enrich our understanding. Also, what came out very strongly was the habitus, the I, we live here. So the concept of habitus, which Yifutwan, I'm sure many geographers and others are aware of his work in relation to the concept of habitus, the normalization of naming, both material and the intangible, for individual and group memory, for rights, for stakeholders. Also then, as is going on at many levels, the attempted manufacture of social consent when it comes to naming, with some old and some new wine. And I use the word wine there as a metaphor in regards to finding a balance. But it can be presented in what sort of bottles? The democratic label as promoted by the UN, or the populist appellation or other agenda. And that is what we must be very much aware of. The socio-political malaise is out there, as we are witnessing in live media daily. So we have to mind the naming and to see where it's coming from and for what reasons. Therefore, we have a strong expectation from the electorates versus what government can actually deliver. Also, many demanding renaming of places. So that must be handled in the context, or not handled, but explored when we think of the real and existentialist aspects as regards fake truths feeding into populisms, our land, our territory, our name. Who exactly? Social media is providing multiple advantages, as we know, but dangers also that can be exploited. Therefore, there is a quest to redefine workable democracy in relation to naming. And it is now going on at global levels with one part of the world or one group influencing the perception of another. So we have this whole copycat effect, for want of a better word. The case studies we are looking at exemplify the above realities at multiple scales, but also at multiple power levels. Therefore, regarding naming, education and training is a necessity in combating ignorance, fake news, fake names and populism in order to enhance democratic ideals and workable solutions as recommended for long-term sustainable development in the SDGs. So, thank you, mille buenas and obrigada.
Thank you so much, Jerry, for this interesting presentation. E, finalmente, eu gostaria de declarar aberto o segundo Sipat, Simpósio Internacional Pan-Americano de Toponímia, e convido o Dr. Peter Jordan, da Academia Austríaca de Ciência, Österreichische Akademie der Wissenschaft, Chair da ICA, na comissão conjunta UGI-ICA, em Toponímia, para proferir a sua palestra de abertura do segundo Simpósio. Seja muito bem-vindo, Peter. Esteja à vontade para começar. Welcome, Peter. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Father. I was allowed to speak 40 minutes. Is it still true? I was allowed to speak 40 minutes.
You have all the time you want.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So let me first of all welcome you also cordially on behalf of our commission as the ICA chair of this commission. We are happy to co-organize the symposium, and I thank the local organizers, and especially Paulo de Menezes, for all their efforts and for the great cooperation. Let me also, as a newly elected vice president of ICOS, of the International Council of Onomastic Sciences, I would also like to convey greetings of this umbrella organizations of all onomasticians. So let me now turn to my opening speech, to my paper. And as it may be expected not to address a very specific topic by an opening speech, I present you some principal thoughts on place names and place naming. So may I ask you for the slides now? They should be handled by the hosts, as I was informed. So may I ask for the first slide?
Peter, if you have the presentation, you can share.
Yes. But I was promised to get it handled from your side. So I will try to find it. Yes.
Eu quero falar inglês, doido, porque ele é americano. Não mexe.
Can you see it? Can you see it?
Yes, Peter.
So fine. So my topic is some principal thoughts on place names and place naming. And let me start with stating that name giving in general expresses responsibility. And this is very well expressed by Genesis 2:20, when it says, "The man gave names to all the cattle and to the birds of the sky and to every beast of the field." And it is very well illustrated by this tapestry, Flemish tapestry, which is exposed in the Galleria dell'Accademia in Florence. And you can see here on the left side Adam, and he's receiving a parade of all the different kinds of animals, and he's naming the animals. So this means that the animals are entrusted to man. The person responsible for something or owning something has the right of naming usually. It is like that when parents name their children. Also, ownership would not be the correct not the correct word in this context. It is rather responsibility or entrustment in this case when parents name their children. This understanding of naming and names is certainly common to all cultures based on the Jewish Christian fundament. I don't have the expertise to judge whether this understanding is universal. But on the other hand, I don't know any culture which would not understand it in this way, naming in this way. So having started with this basic statement on naming and names in general, I would like to proceed specifically with place names and address the following items. First, the place naming process, then the rules of place names in mediating humans and geographical space, and finally, some reflections on place name standardization. So let me first turn to the place naming process. There are three factors involved into this place naming process. First of all, the local community is the center here, illustrated by this circle, in the sense of a group of people who feel to have a common identity. It can vary in size between family partnership, nation, group of citizens, language community, up to the global community, global citizens, so to say. It needs not to be a cohesion group in the sociological sense, in the sense of a group of people tied by personal relations and almost in permanent interaction. It can also just be an identity group, in the sense of a group of people feeling to have a common identity. They need not to have personal relations, they need not to know even not to know each other. This is so, for instance, with a nation, it's the Brazilian nation, for instance, which is a community in this sense, and it's included here. The second factor, also indicated on this slide here, is the community's culture, including language, of course. Culture understood here in the most comprehensive sense as a totality of all human expressions. And the third factor, indicated by the barrow at the bottom here, is geographical space, subdivided into geographical features. Geographical space understood as a totality of all relations between material and immaterial features. The only actor in this process is the local community. It inhabits a certain section of geographical space. It has developed a certain culture, perhaps also a language of its own. It can also be part of another language, of course, and structures complex geographical space mentally into features on the background of its culture and led by its specific, for instance, economic interests, marking these features by place names. This marking is indicated by the arrows here. So at the bottom arrow, you see the different features in which a geographical space is subdivided, and every feature is named. If it's not named, it's not perceived as a feature of its own. It's part of another feature. Names for geographical features at the community's own territory may be called endonyms, in the sense of names from within the community. Endonyms in this sociological sense are symbols of appropriation or of responsibility, in the sense mentioned before. For geographic features outside its territory, a community usually just adopts already existing names, translates them into its own language, or adapts them morphologically or phonetically to make them more handsome, so to say. In contrast to names for features on its own territory, which are endonyms, these are exonyms. These are exonyms needed by community to mark features outside its own territory, but important to this community. In a comfortable way, easy to be pronounced, to be communicated. In contrast to endonyms, exonyms are not symbols of appropriation or only of responsibility, and do not express claims, but indicate the importance of a feature for this community and the relations it has with it. Exonyms just help to integrate this foreign feature into the cultural sphere of a community and help to avoid exclusion and alienation. But it is also true that the use of exonyms is sometimes conceived as expressing claims, especially when exonyms correspond to historical endonyms. But this is a misunderstanding which should be erased, also by politically sensitive use of exonyms. Naming is done either by convention between the members of a community or by an institution charged and legitimized by the community for this purpose. Of course, also an individual can attribute a name to a feature, but such a name will not get into use, assume communicative value, and persist if it is not accepted by the community. Only if it is accepted by other members of the same community, it gets communicative value, of course, and it will persist. So it is always, at the end, the community who acts in this process. It's the only actor in this process. No community, however, is completely homogeneous. It is always composed of a dominant portion and a non-dominant subgroups. The dominant portion of a community is, of course, in the position to decree the use of a name, to make other people obliged to use this name, whether they like it or not. It is also true that we have always multiple identities. We are not belonging only to one community, but rather to a multitude of them. We have, in fact, multiple group identities, also space-related identities. These various communities have usually also different relations to space, feel responsible for different sections of spatial reality. We are global citizens, as you can see here on the top. If we engage ourselves for questions like climate change, for instance, or global disparities in development and so on. Global institutions and organizations like the United Nations, for instance, are supporting this community, this global community, or this feeling to be a global community. We are, at the same time, inhabitants of our continent, as far as we feel responsible and engage ourselves for this continent. We are, at the same time, citizens of an association of countries, like the European Union, for instance. We are members of a language community, like, for instance, the Portuguese community. We are members of a nation. We are citizens of a country. We are inhabitants of a region, of a city, of a commune, of a village, for instance. And almost all these communities are in a way organized and feel a responsibility for a certain section of space. And all of these mentioned have certainly a specific relation to space. But there may also be communities with the same relation to space, inhabiting the same section of space. So different just by cultural characteristics, inhabiting the same space, the same section of reality, the same section of space, but different by ethnicity, by language, by religion, and so on. Like it is in minority situations, when a given territory is settled not only by one, but by several communities. All these communities are also active in naming, but they can attribute endonyms in the sense of names from within, only to geographical features at their very own level, at their very own scale. Since the competence for attributing a name, for applying the endonym, is regulated by the principle of subsidiarity. It is always a smaller community, the community closer to the feature and actually responsible for this feature, who has the primary right to attribute a name. Thus, for instance, the name for the Earth is certainly an endonym in all languages spoken on Earth, because we are all Earthlings, we are all inhabitants of the Earth. It's the endonym in all the languages. Names for individual features on Earth are, however, not anymore endonyms in all languages, even if we all feel to be global citizens. Thus, the name for a certain country is certainly an endonym in the language of all communities forming the permanent population of it, while not all the names in the languages of non-dominant communities for the capital of this country will be endonyms, because not all of them will be well established in this capital. These communities, not all of them will be well established in this capital. This principle of subsidiarity is also valid within a certain language, not only between languages, but also within a certain language. So not only when communities with different languages are involved. It occurs frequently that the local population calls a village differently from outsiders, speaking the same language. Based on this concept, I would define the endonym as the name accepted and used by the local community, and the exonym as the name not used by the local community. It is very true that these definitions differ from Angeng's definitions as well as from Eiko's definitions, but these are the definitions we arrived at the end of our discussion in our Angeng working group on exonyms. And just the political veto at the end prevented passing these definitions. So this was our general opinion in the working group on exonyms up to the end, up to the very end. Thus the endonym, and according to these definitions, the endonym-exonym divide corresponds exactly to the divide between space and place in the sense of Vir Vaudoin, quoted earlier by Jerry. This means the divide between neutral space and this section of space to which a certain human community has assumed relations, place. So if I have an endonym for a certain section of space, it becomes place for me. It turns from space, from neutral space into place. This divide also corresponds to the basic human attitude of discerning between mine and yours, between ours and theirs, and to the other basic human attitude of territoriality, the desire to own a place, which exists at all levels of human community building. This divide is also transferable to other name categories, like ethnonyms, names of peoples, of nations, for instance, names of institutions. This means to everything where an inside as well as an external view is relevant. In all these cases, we have an name from the inside, from insiders, used by insiders, and the name used by outsiders, the endonym and the exonym. So it is really a basic onomastic concept, this divide between endonym and exonym. Now let me turn to the second part of my presentation, roles of place names in mediating humans and geographical space. I think that place names can have four main functions in relating humans to geographical space. This is not true for all place names. They can have this function. First of all, they often reflect characteristics of space important for a certain community. They often describe location, morphology, waters, vegetation, soils of a certain place, or functions of a place within geographical space, like the bridge function, port function, pass function, market function, and so on. They highlight in this way characteristics that seemed important to the people who named the place, on the background of their culture and their specific interests. Farmers had naming motives different from herdsmen. Seafarers had different naming motives from mountain dwellers. We, the people living today, have naming motives different from our ancestors. For us, the meaning of a name can have lost its transparency. For instance, when the name originates from a language spoken earlier and not anymore at this same place. The meaning attributed to the feature and expressed may have lost its importance for us, since our culture and interests are different from the culture when the feature was named, or by which the feature was named. But it can be assumed that no name was meaningless for the people who were the first to apply it. I think there's no case where just a name was given without any meaning. So place names reflect the perception of space by a certain community and are condensed narratives into two directions about the feature named and about the cultural disposition of the name-giving community. Then a second role is place names mark the territory of a community. Place names are, among other symbols, markers of a group's own territory. I must not enlarge on this role here, since I have discussed it already in the context of the naming process. Just an illustration here. The territory is marked by a signpost. It's a boundary of the Austrian province of Styria, which is marked by signposts of this kind, showing all the exonyms of the place of the province. It's a rather exceptional way of marking a territory. It's also not the usual case in Austria. It's just very exceptional and remarkable, perhaps. Let me turn to the third role. Place names structure space mentally. Place names structure space mentally. They help to subdivide complex spatial reality into features. Every geographical feature, in the sense of a subunit of geographical space, is a mental construct. This is especially obvious with landscapes, cultural regions, or macroregions, lacking concrete or clear limits like current administrative boundaries, natural natural boundaries like mountain ranges or rivers. For instance, Europe or the macro regions of Europe are obviously just a scientific construct. So they are mental constructs, and cannot be proved by empirical evidence, so to say. It is impossible to find clear boundaries for Central Europe, for instance, or for Southeast Europe in reality. A place name is the vehicle, the instrument in this process of mental structuring of space. Without place names, we would not be able to establish a system of space-related identities, to communicate this system, and to maintain it. In many cases, like it is with cultural regions or with landscapes, the place name is in fact the only identifier of a geographical feature. Nothing else hints at this identity and at this feature, so to say. It's more or less just the place name. And the section of space without a name is obviously not conceived as a feature in its own right, just as a part of another feature. Let me turn to the fourth role, the last role. Place names support emotional ties between humans and place and promote in this way space-related identity building. Place names, if somebody acquainted with a place reads, mentions, or memorizes a place name, this recalls all the contents of the space-related concept with him or with her, reminds him of sights, persons, smells, sounds, and events associated with this place, and lets the feel of a place arise, as Yifu Duan calls it. Therefore, it is, for instance, very important for minorities to have their place names represented in public space, as it is here on this slide with a place in Italy, nearby Trieste. They give these communities a feeling of belonging, of being at home there. It is also a kind of an affirmative action, since non-dominant groups are in special need of being affirmed. For them, group identity, including space-related identity, is a prominent part of it. As a prominent part of it means a daily challenge, much more than for a dominant group. The main task of minority place names on signposts is not information, assuming that somebody could not be able to read the name in the dominant language, but symbolic representation of the minority. This is the main task. The minority is to be affirmed that it is also their place. The minority has a share in its identity, in the place's identity. Therefore, it is also important that on the signpost figures the endonym as it is